Welcome to Golf Industry Guru and the Gig Podcast, where we interview the best and brightest golf and hospitality leaders on the planet. On today's episode, you will learn some proven real-world solutions that'll help you and your team solve some of your biggest golf business challenges. So stick around for some tips, tools, and training to get you, your people, and your business powered on. Here's your host, James Cronk.
Well, hello, Gig Nation, and welcome to another Golf Industry Guru podcast. I am your host, James Cronk, and it is my pleasure to bring to you another guru from outside the golf industry that is going to share with you some best practices about that topic that comes up all the time whenever we are doing manager surveys, employee surveys, and we're talking about how to improve a workplace, how to improve a workplace culture. And you know the answer to this question because you've heard it many times, and you've certainly heard me talk about it many times, which is the issue of communication. And how do we communicate better as leaders, as managers, as fellow employees, internally with each other so that we can improve the overall experience for everybody involved. And so I am very excited. I came across this guru on LinkedIn and through some other connections, was fascinated by his history, his work history, his background. You're going to recognize some of the things that he's talked about what he does, what he has done for a living. But now he is a coach, a leadership coach that focuses on numerous different leadership skills and qualities. And please join me in welcoming our guru of the day, Mr. Colin Cox. Colin, welcome to the Gig Podcast.
Thanks so much, James. Super awesome to be called the expert of the day, the guru of the day. Love that. I could get into that.
You are joining a long list of gurus that we have had on this podcast. And Colin, we have talked about, in various different ways this topic before. But what I love about what we're going to talk about with you today is really delving deeper into leadership communication, kind of executive communication, kind of communication from the top, so to speak, and how it relates to communicating with each other or even with everything from the media to your customers, your members, et cetera, et cetera. So, but first of all, before we get into that, Colin, tell everybody a little bit more about your fascinating background and the different journeys along the way. Take your time that has got you to this point today where you are connected with so many different organizations and industries that seek out your advice when it comes to leadership training and coaching.
Yeah, thanks, James. Super happy to share that. One of the most interesting things, I guess, about my background is I started my career quite young. I was 15 years old and started working at Electronic Arts EA Sports here in Vancouver, in Burnaby. And that's quite young. The sort of slightly bigger story there is I was really, really into ice hockey, into hockey as a kid, tore my knee ligaments at 15, got depressed, started hanging around the wrong kids in school, and I dropped out in grade 11.
Wow. Yeah,
and I was extremely fortunate. My mom worked for a place called the Burnaby Family Life Institute. They were a government-funded organization that had programs to help troubled teens, single moms, battered women, all kinds of great programs. And my mom said, look, if you're not going to go to school, why don't you come in this program? They're going to teach you some soft skills. Hey, communication. They're going to teach you some soft skills, how to write a resume, how to do a job interview, and they'll help you find work placement. And so I wrote video games as a hobby on the application form. And that changed my life. One of the coordinators came to me and said, Colin, I see you like video games. Well, we had a prior student in this program go do their work experience at Electronic Arts. Would you like to go do that? And everyone else in this program they're going to retail like Big O Tires and A&B Sound for their 5-week work experience. I went to EA. I loved it. I mean, it was the intersection of my passions: technology, video games, sports.
And Colin, I'm not going to give away any secrets because you're a young-looking guy, but knowing the history, being a Vancouverite as well in British Columbia, Canada, was that kind of like when EA Sports was literally just kind of on the scene, and the company was probably pretty fresh in British Columbia, Canada? Is that correct?
It was. When I joined, there were about 60 employees. The first game I ever worked on was FIFA Soccer for the Sega CD, if you remember that.
Sure, you bet. And so what was some of the experiences, like what were some of the things you ended up, my understanding, you were there for a while, right? And you worked on some amazing things that everyone around the world would recognize, I think.
Yeah, and I worked in a lot of the back-end tech roles. So that meant I wasn't on a specific game team like FIFA or NHL or Tiger Woods Golf. I got to work on all of them. So worked on a lot of those franchises. Need for Speed was there when we started building that. So and I'm a high school dropout. So a lot of my success when I reflect back on my career really does come down to interpersonal skills. And I got into leadership early. Because no one back then, that's the early to mid 90s, not everybody had a lot of technical aptitude. So myself and a few other people, we started this hardware compatibility testing lab where we tested all of our games coming out with all the different computer components. And when the first managers of those groups moved on to other parts of EA, myself and another colleague inherited the team. So I was a team lead at 17 years old. Wow.
And so how long did you spend at EA Sports?
I stayed there for just shy of 7 years. So I left EA about October 2000, right around the height of the .com bubble, to go to a startup. Lovely timing. And, I ended up taking most of a year off. EA was a lot of crunch hours, some 80-hour weeks. So my late teens and early 20s were spent working. So I took a year off and then eventually got back in the workplace.
We'll get back to our conversation in a moment. But first, are you ready to learn from the world's greatest golf and hospitality industry leaders? Train your team and grow your business with a membership to Golf Industry Guru. Join for less than $3 per day and give your entire team access to over 150 hours of courses, podcasts, webinars, templates, articles, live Q&A calls, and more. Free content samples and registration details at golfindustryguru.com.
When you kind of left EA Sports, you moved in some other roles and kind of you've obviously come into the position of being a leadership coach. What was your last kind of, typical 9-to-5 kind of work job before you got into coaching?
Yeah, the last 9-to-5 work job was actually in Europe. It was chief operating officer for a company called Demonware. Not everyone here will have heard of Demonware. Demonware is the online studio for Activision. So if you've ever heard of games like Call of Duty, Guitar Hero, I spent 7 years working as COO for Demonware. So we did all of the online services for those games. So if you or a spouse or a child spends way too much time with Call of Duty, I'm very sorry.
Yes, this might be the only podcast my son listens to because if I connect him to Colin and Call of Duty, he'll know exactly what we're talking about. So Colin, from a communication standpoint, obviously, and that's so fascinating because we talk about how gaming actually is, that typical kind of stereotype of that gaming is hindering the youth's ability to be a better communicator because they're sitting alone in the dark, like my teenage son gaming until 2:00 in the morning when he's supposed to be doing homework or getting some sleep. And so from a communication standpoint, and let's just move it forward to the hospitality industry, which we're part of, obviously. What are some of the things that you see that what creates poor communication, I guess. Like, before we talk about some of the solutions, what do you think creates a workplace maybe that has ineffective communication?
Yeah, we can unpack that. But the thing I'll start off with is actually related to what I think video games and technology has done to change the world. And that is, people are used to instant gratification.
Yes.
Right? And when I relate that to communication, what people generally consider effective communication today is you get to the point and you do it quick. Mm-hmm. And a lot of communication doesn't do that. A lot of communication will bury the lead. Oh, I'm going to send an email to all of my staff, and I'm going to mention 7 different things, and it's going to be 8 pages long, and nobody reads it because everybody's so used to that get to the point, the instant TikTok scroll. So having a key message and leading with your conclusion, those are 2 things that I've observed help communication be a lot better received.
And that kind of gets into, a document that we're talking about with regards to on our gig platform, which is kind of the 6 steps to kind of, effective communication. So I'd love to kind of ask you about walking through maybe a little bit more in detail, if you don't mind, kind of what, you believe are some of the skills that leaders should have, whether it's in written communication or verbal communication or social media communication, in 50 characters or less. So, you just mentioned right there, I guess, like starting off, number 1, kind of like having a clear message. What is that? What does that mean? Like, can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah. I mean, the best place to start, if you're sitting down to craft a message, whether that's an email to your members, an email to your staff, an update to your board, whether you're creating a presentation for investment, all of these different vehicles for communication, the first place that really helps is, what's your key point? And a lot of the times when we start without thinking about that, the message we end up with is more rambly and incoherent. So, sometimes I'll see an email in the corporate world from a leader, and there's no structure. There's maybe 4 or 5 different things that are disjointed. They're just trying to cram into one email because, well, I suppose they're choosing efficiency, right? Why don't I just send one email with 5 points? But the problem is, again, people's attention spans. They're snacking on email all day. So for them to get an email with one clear message, one key point, it really, really helps.
So having a clear message and you're a proponent of having one message. Is it one message per communication, or is it 3 clear messages in one communication? Is it just making sure that you're really clear about what you're trying to talk about?
Yeah, I think the simpler the better, right? Einstein said things should be as simple as possible, no simpler. And I love applying that to communication. If you're crafting a town hall update for all of your employees, for example, you might have 3 or 4 different topics. They're all related to leadership communication to the group, but they might be 4 separate things. That's okay. But if you are sending out one message, actually what helps, there's another skill I like called bookending, which is you have your key message, you might break it into 3 subtopics, and you tell people, right? Bookending is this. Tell people what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. And by doing that, it gives people a framework. Oh, okay, James's key message is X. He's going to talk about A, B, and C in support of X. And it doesn't have to be 3s, but there's something magical about 3s. It's just easy to work with and easy for people to remember and follow.
Yeah, it's true. I use 3s almost all the time in giving presentations. It's always that, like you said, it's that 3 thing. Point number 2, and I guess in the speaker world, Colin, they have this kind of strategy, I guess, or best practice, which is, you've got to kind of tell people what their problem is before you tell them what the solution is, right? It's just like, do you have this problem? If you have this problem, here's A, B, and C, right? That's going to kind of help you solve that problem. And you talk about in your messaging and in the templates that you've shared with us on our gig platform, number 2, which is kind of leading with the conclusion. So talk a little bit more about that and how that relates to kind of being clear about what your solution is versus the problem.
Yeah. I'll tell a story to illustrate it.
Please.
I think that'll do the best job. I was heading down to California for an investment meeting, and embarrassingly, the first time we did it with this group, our main ask, our conclusion, we kept to the very end. We felt like we have to tell them a narrative. We have to give them every single detail so that when we finally get to our ask, they will have all the context to say yes. And in practice, what happened is they were lost, right? They didn't know what the point of our presentation was. They didn't know what we were asking for. So the main thing we changed and learned and applied in the future is let's lead with our conclusion. We're looking for X amount of money to do these 3 things. And when we led with that conclusion and tie that with bookending, right? The 3 things we're going to do with this investment are A, B, and C. Let's go in and talk to you about A, and then B, and then C. And then we would conclude again with a summary of all of it and a restatement of that call to action of what we're requesting. And it worked so much better to get the request out right up front. It gave them context to follow us.
That's funny. I was thinking when you were telling that story, I followed, I've had the unfortunate responsibility over my years of having to let people go. And I followed that same philosophy. When someone sits down at the desk, that's the first thing I say. I'm sorry, but I have to, terminate your employment. And then I start talking about the whys and the next steps and the blah, 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 blah. But otherwise, they're sitting there twisting in the wind, wondering like, what are you getting at? Or if it dawns on them, just like, get to the frickin' point, it's just like, it's like they want to know, or you leave them hanging kind of, if you're not kind of with the conclusion right away. Right. And so it's a difficult situation, but I think it's incredibly important to just state it right up front. Right, about what it is that why are you sitting down this desk? Here's the reason why I brought you in the office, and then they go, okay. And it's even if you're talking about a disciplinary situation or a positive situation. It's like, why'd you call me in the office? The reason why I brought you in the office is talk about X. Oh, okay. All right. Then they breathe, then they calm down, then they listen, right? Then you can have proper communication. Otherwise, they're not listening to anything you're saying. They're jumping ahead to their own conclusions. Would you agree?
100%. And here's something I've observed. People love to be on page 9 of a one-page story. Too much so. Right. I don't know what it is. We do it in meetings. We do it when we write emails. We do it when we're talking to people. And look, if you need a 9-page story, if you need details, go nuts. But too often, all that needs to be said could take 30 seconds and someone's taking 8 minutes to say it. Mm-hmm. And when you don't lead with the conclusion and you're rambling on page 9 of a one-page story, you lose people. Mm-hmm. So if you want to be an effective communicator, just getting to the point right up front just makes a big difference.
You talk about knowing your audience and what they care about. And maybe can you give some examples about how you would incorporate that into a communication piece?
Yeah, let me go to another story about that. 2010, working and living in London, England at a tech company called Rackspace. We manage servers for people in data centers, right? Big. But that's what we did. And we entered the UK's National Customer Service Awards. We had to create a pitch, a presentation to judges on why we were the best customer service B2B team in all of the UK. And our entire planning around building up the presentation and the delivery of that 15-minute presentation was knowing our audience. We would have been dead in the water if we had walked in there assuming they understood technology, assuming they understood hosting, even assuming they understood certain acronyms in the customer service world. So one of them is NPS, Net Promoter Score. And we even still didn't assume they knew that. This is the judging panel, right? So when I was speaking in the presentation with the panel of judges, Net Promoter Score was a big part of our presentation. And I asked them, I paused and said, the way we measure customer loyalty is using NPS, Net Promoter Score. Are you aware of NPS? 3 of the judges nodded their heads. 1 of them stared blankly at me. I just paused for a moment and said, Net Promoter Score was created by Fred Reichheld in his book. It's a standard way across industries you can measure customer loyalty. And the judge looked at me and nodded, thank you. Mm-hmm. If I had not done that, if I had assumed they knew that, I would have lost her attention. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Instead, we kept her attention. So knowing your audience that's a big part. They don't have the same knowledge you do necessarily. So make sure that the way, what you share, the acronyms you use, they either know or that you can explain them because it's necessary to do so.
Yeah, that's excellent. And what I love about that point about what I like is what they care about, because, so often in our world, in the club world, we'll talk about, we had so much rain in the month of August and the greens are in bad condition and we're short staffed because kids are going back to school and, it's excuse after excuse after excuse. What they want to know is, is the men's night still happening on Thursday? And, can we still have our year-end championship? And can I come to the bar tomorrow and have a soda? What they care about is not always what we care about as managers or as operators. And I think it's important still to get those things out. Here's unfortunately, our hours of operation are going to be diminished or challenged in the month of October because all the kids have gone back to school. We're seeking solutions. We're trying to hire some people. If you know anybody, send us our way, but we're doing our best to take care of you. That's what they care about. They get the message that, okay, kids are going back to school. You're short-staffed. Everyone's short-staffed in the hospitality business right now. No one wants to do dishes. They get all those things, but they want to know is how's it going to impact their experience? And if you communicate to them in that effective way, I think there's some value there. Making sure that you just tell them about your excuses, but also how it impacts them and what they care about.
Yeah, it's all about them, right? I believe the responsibility that a message is heard and is effective, it's you, the sender. It's not the receiver navigating through whatever mess you're putting out there. My mentor, Alan Weiss, says this all the time. I love it. Tell people what they need to know, not everything you know. And I don't say that in terms of be opaque and hide things. But depending on your audience, depending on the topic, you don't need to tell them absolutely everything because it's just noise. The signal to noise ratio gets out of whack, and then people don't get the signal you're trying to send. Mm-hmm. So I really like that when you think about your audience. I think The Hero's Journey, by Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey. Have you heard of that before, James?
I have heard of that, but yes.
Yeah, The Hero's Journey, I love it. It's, in a nutshell, just a formula that a lot of media, books, movies can follow. In fact, George Lucas with Star Wars has credited Joseph Campbell and The Hero's Journey for part of his creation of Star Wars. And The Hero's Journey basically is that you've got a character, they have a problem or a dream, and they meet a guide, and the guide will call them to action and give them a plan, and the character then achieves success, right? And a lot of stuff follows this. With communication, it's very similar. All of us as human beings, what's our favorite topic? It's ourselves. We're all the hero in our own stories. And when we are communicating, if we communicate as if we're the character, we're the hero in our story, and the audience are supporting us, it's generally much less effective. So much more effective to approach crafting your message from the position of the guide. Mm-hmm. I have empathy about you, and what you care about. And the message I'm going to give is all in service of helping you navigate the problem or the opportunity. Mm-hmm. And that simple mindset shift just completely changed communication for me.
Yeah, no, that's a great lesson. I also, it makes me think about, the great quote or the whatever story about if you want to be the most liked person in the room, let everybody talk about themselves. You don't talk about yourself. You let people talk about themselves, and then they just think that was the best conversation I had all night. I like that guy, man. I like that James guy, but you don't say a word. You let them talk about themselves, and that's, how to win friends and influence people, right?
It's all that. James, can I share something else related to this? And it's not in our template.
No problem.
I feel compelled to share. I think the most underutilized superpower of communication is actually the skill of listening. And most of the world is not fantastic at this skill. And in my observation, there's 3 levels of listening. Level 1 listening is we're waiting for our turn to speak. We're not actually listening. And to be honest, most of us listen to level 1 most of the time. Why? Because we're the hero in our own story. Someone heard me say, "Oh, you lived in London. We were supposed to go to Tuscany for a holiday, and then COVID whacked our flights, and now I need to chase up the airline with our and you're not even listening anymore. You're thinking about yourself, right?"
Well, you're right. You want to tell your London story. You said you worked in London. Oh, I got to tell them my London story. I was in London once. You're right. We're waiting for our turn to speak. What's the second level?
That's level 1. Level 2 listening is your full attention is on the speaker, whether it's in a meeting, someone on the podcast, at home in a conversation. Your full attention is on the person speaking. Your full intention is to understand their perspective, even if you might disagree with it. And especially if you might disagree with it. Right? That's what Stephen Covey will call that: seek first to understand, then be understood. But when you're in level 2 listening, you're out of your hero story. You're fully in that guide part of the hero's journey, and you're just listening to understand someone else's perspective. And you might disagree with it. That's fine. Understanding and agreement are 2 different things. Quite often we confuse them. So when you're in level 2 listening, you might say, "Hey, James, if I understand you correctly, your position on this topic is A and B, right?" And James says, "Yeah, you got me, Colin." And if I say, "James, I see it a bit differently. Can I share my perspective?" How much more likely are you going to listen to me?
Very much.
Than if I just talk at you, right? So that's level 2 listening. It's an absolute superpower of empathy, of understanding others. And when we relate it to crafting a message for your audience, like who is your audience? What do they care about? You find that out by getting out of your hero story and listening at level 2.
Love it. Love it. So share with us. I've been listening. I've been listening to 1. I've been listening to 2. I haven't talked. What's level 3?
Level 3 listening is listening to the environment. All the nonverbal cues. So body language, tone of voice, eye contact, who sits next to who around the boardroom table or doesn't. It's listening to what's not being said. And it's listening to all these things. And most experts predict, if you look at studies, somewhere between 70 and 90% of all communication is nonverbal. Some of us are much better at listening to the environment than others naturally, but it is a skill you can work on and develop.
Wow. I love that. No, you can take a sidestep anytime and share. That's some incredibly valuable content, Colin. That's our next podcast, is the art of listening, I think. You talk in your template, step number 4, about the call to action, and about, I assume it's about, the purpose of your message, about how you want your message to create action of some kind, or create a response of some kind. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. It's really helpful to get clear on what do you want people to do. Right. And sometimes that's easy. Sometimes it's a little less easy. Here's an example. I chair 2 CEO peer groups in Vancouver, very busy people. And if I'm running a retreat and I need 14 CEOs to call and book their room at the resort we're at, if I send them an email with a vague subject like upcoming retreat, and I bury somewhere in my message the request for them to call it, guess what they're going to do? They won't do it. It's not because they don't want to. It's because time is scarce. And when they see an email like retreat update, they're like, okay, well, I'll get to that later. Mm-hmm. But in the subject line, if I put September retreat dash, please book your room by Friday, guess what's going to happen? They're going to book their rooms.
Yes.
I'm not burying the conclusion. I'm not burying the call to action. I'm making it crystal clear. And if you can't put it in the subject, often I'll put it right at the top of the email. I might use the term TLDR. Not everybody's heard that, but TLDR means too long didn't read.
Right.
And basically it's like saying, quick summary, right? So you just put that right at the top. If this is too long for you, you don't have time to read it, just do this one thing.
Right.
And then you can go and share the rest of your information.
Right. Why is it that we, in our communications, feel the need to, create poems and prose and flowers and sell people? Like, why do we feel that is it rude to be direct and blunt in our clear communication, or our lead with our conclusion, or tell people what we want, or call to action? Or is it just bad? Is it just bad habits and bad communication?
I think one of the main drivers, to be honest, is that, most of the leaders that I've worked with and I work with, they don't get into leadership to be a great leader or to be a great communicator. They love their craft. I love marketing, or I love finance, or I love creating products, or I love running golf clubs. And so it's their craft that drives their passion. And now that you're leading other people, there's this whole other set of skills, which includes effective communication, that typically wasn't forced as part of the learning process, right? Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of us have never really had formal training or really put serious effort into improving our communication skills. I think that's the biggest reason why it comes up all the time on engagement surveys. Mm-hmm. James, to your point at the front, like, it's almost always in the top 3. We have poor communication here.
Mm-hmm. There's no doubt. It certainly does. Talk about using the 3-part structure. And I guess that gets back to, maybe you were talking about threes. Is that what that relates to? Right. So
yeah. It's just about having a framework for your audience to follow your message. And depending on how long the message and what it is, there's different ways, but again, it just helps to create a structure for people, especially to keep their attention, right? Today, attention spans are short. So, like, if you don't bookend, if you don't tell me what you're going to talk about and you just start talking, I don't know if you're going to talk for the next 10 seconds, 10 minutes, or 10 hours about this, and my attention's going to go. Mm-hmm. But if I know, you're going to talk about 3 things, and now you're talking about number 1, I know where we are. And I know where we're going, and you've got my attention. Mm-hmm. It helps stickiness too. It helps retention, especially when you book in at the end, the 3 things I talked about are ABC. Then people are like, oh, okay, that's what the 3 key points were.
It's the same lesson. It's very important when you're talking about giving a speech, right? And giving a presentation. So when we stand in front of a room of people, it's no different. It's like, this is how long I'm going to talk for. This is what I'm going to talk about. Here's the takeaways. Here's the things you're going to learn, or here's what we're going to discuss or collaborate with, or you're going to share with your peers, right? You want to set them up in the very beginning for understanding what their next 30 minutes, 45 minutes, hour is going to be, even 3 hours, whatever is the length of the day or the session, right? It's like presenting the agenda. Otherwise, if you've got 9 points to go through in the course of a 3-hour workshop, and you spend the first hour on point number 1, well, you're in trouble, right? And you're going to run. And you see this. I mean, Colin, you and I have been in conferences all over the place, I have no doubt, and seen speakers that all of a sudden, they've got 34 slides and they go through the last 13 slides in 3 minutes because they've run out of time, or they haven't kind of paced themselves with that message, right? And I find the same thing with regards to written communication or verbal communication. If you want to make people at ease, you want to make sure that they know what's coming, or they're excited about what's coming, because otherwise they, like you said, they don't listen to what your message is. They think about your speaking. Like, they're just like, I wonder when he's going to get to slide 20 because he's got 40 more slides to go. Or he said, we've got 5 things to talk about and there's only 10 minutes left. Like, I mean, that's what they start thinking about. They don't think at all about what you're saying. They're thinking about how are you actually going to manage your time in front of us. So when you're standing in front of a group and you're standing in front of a room or a board of directors or members, it's critical, isn't it? I mean, it really is. It's an art of making sure that you say enough, but not more than enough.
Yeah. And actually the place where this phenomenon has an even bigger detrimental effect is in our meetings. We will get into an exec team meeting and there's 5 agenda topics and they're vaguely worded, and we get on to the first and we talk about it for 58 minutes. Mm-hmm. And there's a few different reasons we do that. One of them is we like to be on page 9 of a 1-page story. I think piggybacking should be outlawed in meetings. Mm-hmm. Oh, let me just piggyback on what Sally said. No.
Yes.
You don't need to prove to your ego in this room that we know you're smart. Just stop it.
Yes.
No piggybacking.
Exactly. No piggybacking.
And really what's going on there is, here's another communication thing. The vagueness, right? Agenda topics that are vague. We're going to talk about Project X. Well, good. How long is a piece of string?
Right.
And that might mean we don't have time for the other 4 things on the agenda. We pay the price for not giving them the right time. So a simple tip for meetings is just name your agenda topics with what done looks like. Mm-hmm. So instead of Project X, resourcing decision on Project X. Now you have a much more focused thing, a much more focused meeting topic.
Do you have a trick for if you're leading a meeting and you have a person in the meeting that likes to hear themselves talk, that once again wants to tell 9 pages for a 1-page story?
How can we politely interrupt them?
Yeah. Like, do you have an effective statement that's a good way of kind of respectfully telling someone to shut up?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Here's a few examples. Barry, excuse me, could you bottom line that for us? Barry, excuse me, what are we solving for here? These types of questions snap us out of those rabbit trails that are unnecessary, back to the point. And they work really well. Another great tip you can do is the 3-finger rule for your meetings. So I've done this for years, in-person, virtual, all of it works. When we're talking, instead of a free-for-all, we agree that if someone's talking and someone else wants to make a point on point, they hold up 1 finger. If they want to make a tangential point, which is worth making, they'll hold up 2 fingers. And if while I'm talking, someone holds up 2 fingers and then someone else holds up 1 finger, the person holding up 1 finger goes first because it supersedes. 3 fingers is we beat this topic to death and we need to move on.
I like it.
I've been in some virtual meetings where just the number 3 in chat pops up and everyone chuckles and they say, okay, let's move on.
Yeah, that's hilarious. I love it. One of the things that we've learned during COVID, for example, I guess that's probably the simplest and most straightforward kind of example of something that every operator in the golf business kind of faced. But there's other examples, when you've got vandalism, or when someone has an accident, or when there's a financial crisis in the club, or you're standing in front of members and they want to know how come the renovation budget went over by 42%. we're not all skilled in being a politician. Like you said, and I love what you said, which is that we get in this business because we're passionate about the business. It doesn't mean that we're able to stand in front of 300 angry mob and reflect or deal with difficult questions. So number 6 on your kind of effective leadership communication talks about being prepared for difficult questions. How do you deal with, manage, prepare for difficult questions?
Yeah, the main thing that helps me, and depending on what it is, but again, internal business presentation, you're pitching for investment, and the purse string holders are gonna throw darts at you, right? Like they should, right? They need to be critical because everyone's asking for things. Mm-hmm. And so the problem is if you try to answer every objection in your presentation, then your narrative is too big. Mm-hmm. Right. So when I'm building slide decks in that context, it might be 10 slides of the narrative and maybe another 20 of appendix slides. Because, okay, we don't need to tell that big story because it's too much. But if they have a question there, we can bungee jump down into that appendix slide and we're prepared. The difficult questions actually go even beyond the appendix slides. So what I do is create a separate document and I think through what are all the worst, most difficult questions I could possibly get asked. And I will think through them and I'll come up with whatever my answer is ahead of time. And the way that helps is when you then get asked in a meeting, on stage in front of a group or your staff, then you're not thinking on the fly, right? You've got an idea over how you'd respond. And related to that, I think that, we all tend to see the world through a default set of glasses or lenses, right? Some of us are optimists. By default, we see all the benefits in something. Others, by default, see the risks, right? By default, I can see everything that can go wrong with this plan here. Some of us, by default, are very data or numbers driven. Show me the data. Where's the data? And some of us are very intuition or gut feel driven. And typically what can happen is that when you get people on a team or in a group together who have different default perspectives and don't have the awareness that all those perspectives are valuable, then they just think everyone else is wrong. And you get unhealthy conflict, right? Where we're just not listening to each other. And so when we relate that to communicating, right? A mistake I see a lot of executive leaders make is when I go on stage and communicate to my board or my staff or my clients, I need to present the ponies and rainbows version. And I'll tell you what happens when you do that. And when you don't address elephants in the room is you lose credibility. Totally. Because people say, well, you're not acknowledging there's some challenges here. Mm-hmm. And I don't believe you. I don't trust you. Mm-hmm. Right. And trust is the foundation of great communication. Mm-hmm. Right. If you are eloquent and well-spoken and well put together and I don't trust you, it doesn't matter what your message is. Right. And vice versa. I give you the benefit of the doubt if it's not so polished, but I trust you. Mm-hmm. So I like to think when you're preparing for those difficult types of conversations, it's not hide all the negative news, but actually, especially the bigger the audience you're communicating to, if your message can cover what's the upside here, what are the challenges, what's some data, and how do we feel, the 4 groups that identify strongly with one of those perspectives will feel more heard.
That's excellent. Excellent, Colin. I love it. I mean, wow, so many good takeaways. I've got so many notes kind of on my page here about how these types of lessons and messages can apply whether you are a supervisor in a kitchen or whether or not you're the CEO, general manager with 300 employees and 1,000 members that you kind of have to deal with, right? I mean, communication is a lifelong journey of learning how to be a better communicator, whether it's at home, whether it's with your friends, whether it's at work. But if you're a leader and you are responsible for motivating and managing people, obviously, communication is something that you want to continually work on and kind of improve upon. And so, with that, Colin, I mean, I guess I'd ask you a final question, which is, if you were talking to a young employee that aspires one day to lead people, to be a manager, to be a leader of people, and when you think about listening and communication and empathy and trust and all those types of things, is there a mentor you would get them to follow? Is there a book you'd get them to read? Is there a path you'd get them to take? What would be your kind of sage advice, your guru advice to someone that wants to improve their communication knowledge? And really like it's talked about many times, the art of communication. It's not just happenstance. It's the effort. It's the art of communication. Like what you're talking about today. What words of advice would you give someone?
The beauty with a skill like communication is you have an opportunity to practice it every single day. And what's the colloquial saying out there? Like get 1% better every day and you're twice as good in 70 days. So communication, you can practice it at home, in the workplace, all these different mediums. And of anything you do, just little tweaks to how you prepare for and communicate and how you learn from that will make the biggest difference. If I would suggest a skill, especially if you're younger and starting your journey of leading people, it's really that skill of empathic listening, right? Listening at level 2 and 3, getting out of your hero story. It's not about you. It's about your people. And so work on that. I actually think there's a gap, and maybe your audience can point me in a direction, but when I think about various leadership skills, decisiveness, productivity, leading change, there's usually someone really well known and some good resources. I think there's a gap for communication. I think there is. So I don't know where to point people for a book. Shameless plug. I built an online course.
Please tell
called
us.
Communicate Like a Pro. Because I see a gap in the market there of really useful, practical resources to help people communicate. So maybe I just can't see what's out there. But my course, Communicate Like a Pro, has got practical templates and guidance on how to communicate effectively.
Our listeners will be able to click on some links that are attached to this podcast. But Colin, tell our listeners how they can get in touch with you. They can look into your course, your online course. They can take no matter where they are located in the world. How does one of our Gig Nation get more in touch with Colin Cox?
Yeah, the best place, colincox.com. You can find everything from there. And I'm active on LinkedIn. So if you want, regular, just small, short, practical tips on leadership in general, you can follow me on LinkedIn.
Yeah, you certainly are. And I love all your stuff. And there's some awesome content that I've grabbed and borrowed and stolen from you on LinkedIn. So it's great, Colin. Hey, before I sign off, question, do we have the same book behind us on the wall? What is the image behind you over there on the wall to the left?
We do.
Oh,
That's,
we do too. There you
places
go.
You'll go.
Wow. Speaking of a great communicator, right? Dr. Seuss. Well, Scott, both call you. You listeners can't see it, but Colin, in his background, has a picture on his wall, and I have the actual book on my bookshelf right behind my bald head, which is the great, wonderful, motivating book by Dr. Seuss, Oh, the Places You Will Go. So, Colin, you have taken us lots of places today. Certainly appreciate it with some great insight about communication. I invite all of our listeners to first of all, follow you on LinkedIn, reach out to you, look at your wonderfully inexpensive and fantastic online course on clear communication. And just a pleasure to have you, Colin. Look forward to doing this again.
Awesome. Thanks so much, James. Really enjoyed the conversation. And look forward to maybe again one time.
You got it. Well, next one, I think we're going to talk about the art of listening, because that little excerpt there about the three elements of listening, I love that. I'm sure we could talk for another 45 minutes about that. But that's what we have time for today, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Gig Podcast. And as always, we will see you again on the inside.
Thanks for listening to the Gig Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and mostly that you learned a few things that will help you improve your business. Join us next time as we continue to bring you the best and brightest golf and hospitality leaders on the planet. Thanks for listening.